The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as the storm rolled in. Inside, the house was silent, save for the occasional creaks and groans of the aging structure. Maria sat in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, staring into the flickering glow of the fireplace. The flames danced wildly, casting shadows across the walls, which seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. Her heart pounded as the eerie sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, yet when she looked, no one was there. She shook her head, trying to shake off the feeling that she wasn't alone. It had started a few nights ago, a sense that something was watching her, waiting. She had brushed it off, but now, with the storm trapping her inside, the unease was growing. The footsteps grew louder, more distinct, as if someone was walking closer. Maria's breath hitched, her mind racing. She had checked every door, locked every window, and yet she could still hear the steps moving toward her. The house was old, yes, but it wasn't that old. No one else was supposed to be here. She stood, walking cautiously toward the hallway, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She reached the end of the corridor, but again there was nothing. Just the long, empty hallway, bathed in the dim light from the fireplace. Her heart raced as she turned to go back, but the air felt heavier, colder. It wasn't just the storm outside. A sudden cold chill made her shiver as she walked back toward the living room. As she passed the old grandfather clock in the hallway, the second hand froze mid-tick. She stopped dead in her tracks. The air around her felt thick, almost oppressive. And then it happened. A faint whisper, barely audible. "Maria?" She froze, her blood running cold. That voice, it wasn't hers, it wasn't anyone she recognized. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for the source. Nothing. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Maria!" Her heart pounded, every instinct screaming at her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, all at once, a hollow, rasping sound that sent shivers down her spine. The flickering light of the fire in the living room cast shadows that seemed to move on their own. They twisted and stretched, as though they had a mind of their own, taking shape, growing larger. Without thinking, Maria bolted for the front door, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the lock. She yanked the door open, only to freeze again. The storm had intensified, the wind howling so loudly it was almost deafening, but there was something else. Standing in the doorway, drenched and motionless, was a figure, a person, but not a person. Their features were indistinct, their face a blur like someone had smeared it away, leaving only the dark outline of a human form. The eyes, black empty holes, staring into her soul. Before Maria could react, the figure stepped forward and the door slammed shut behind her with an unnatural force. She staggered back, heart racing. The room around her seemed to distort, the walls closing in, the shadows growing larger, darker. She turned to run, but the figure was already there, standing in the center of the room. She gasped, her chest tightening, as a low, guttural voice filled the room. "You can't escape!" Maria's legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The room grew darker, the shadows enveloping her. The figure reached out, its hand hovering inches from her face. And in that moment, Maria understood. The whispers, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't just the storm. It was the figure, the presence that had been with her all along, waiting for the right moment. Suddenly the room was silent. The storm had stopped. The shadows were gone. Maria looked around, dazed, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Her mind raced, but her body refused to obey. It was as if she was trapped in her own skin, unable to move, to speak, to scream. And then the voice again, softer this time. "You're mine." Maria's vision blurred as the darkness closed in on her. The world around her disappeared, leaving only the cold, empty void. Somewhere, deep in the house, The sound of footsteps echoed again, faint but unmistakable. The storm had passed, but the darkness remained. The following night, Maria sat huddled in her bed, her back pressed against the headboard. The house was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that filled the air like a thick fog. The storm had subsided, leaving an oppressive calm in its wake. She could hear the faintest of creaks and groans from the house settling, but beyond that, it felt like she was the only one left in the world. Yet despite the silence, something gnawed at the edges of her mind. The figure, the voice, the sense that something unseen, something ancient, was still lurking in the corners of the house, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. Maria shook her head. She needed to calm down. Maybe it was just her imagination. After all, there were no other explanations. The house was old, decades of history, forgotten stories and creaking floors. It had to be that, nothing more. But the moment she tried to close her eyes, the whispers came again. Maria, it was soft, almost a sigh, but it filled the entire room. Her breath caught in her throat. She shot up from the bed, glancing frantically around the darkened room. Her eyes locked on the window. Nothing. The wind had died down, but there was a feeling in the air, a sense of heaviness. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't just her name, it was a command. Come to me. Maria froze. She knew she shouldn't move. She knew that whatever it was wanted her to get closer, to walk into its waiting grasp. But the pull, the compulsion, it was too much. Her feet moved before she could even think. She was already halfway down the hallway when she realized what was happening. Her body wasn't her own anymore. She was walking, no, being led, guided by some unseen force toward the basement door. The basement? She had never liked that part of the house. It was always dark, damp, and smelled of mildew. But tonight it felt different. It felt as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Maria's hand reached for the doorknob. She wanted to scream, to stop herself, but the voice kept urging her forward, pushing her, dragging her into the shadows below. The moment she opened the door, the temperature dropped sharply. A cold draft swept over her, and the air smelled of old earth and decay. Maria's heart thundered in her chest as she took the first step down into the basement. Her feet were heavy as though they were sinking into the ground with every step. The door slammed shut behind her. A low, rumbling laugh echoed through the basement, sending a jolt of terror through Maria's spine. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow, reaching out toward her. She turned, trying to run, but she couldn't escape. The darkness was closing in, consuming everything. And then, through the blackness, a pair of eyes appeared, empty, hollow, just like before. The figure stepped forward, its form becoming more defined. It was taller than any person she had ever seen, its limbs long and spindly, its body a twisted, malformed shape. Its face, though blurred, seemed to shift, like the features were being erased and rewritten with every passing second. Maria backed away, terror flooding her veins, but the figure's voice came again, soft and cruel. "You shouldn't have come." She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. "You were always mine," it whispered. As the figure drew closer, the shadows surged forward, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. Maria felt her breath becoming shallow, her vision swimming with dark spots. Her body began to feel numb, heavy, like it was no longer her own. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the figure's eyes staring into hers, deep into her soul. It was as if it was waiting for her to understand something she had known all along but never wanted to accept. Maria was never meant to leave the house. The storm had come to trap her. The house had been waiting, watching her for years, calling to her, drawing her back into its embrace. And now she was finally home. The following morning the house stood silent again. The storm had passed, the winds had died down, and the sun rose, casting its first light across the old weathered house. Everything seemed peaceful. But deep within the walls, something stirred. The sound of footsteps echoed again, soft but unmistakable, and Maria's voice whispered just out of reach, "Come to me." The storm had passed, but the darkness remained.